Have you ever gone camping only to feel like you weren't truly alone? Like something unseen was lurking just beyond the light of your campfire? Tonight, we dive into a chilling tale of an ordinary camping trip that turned into a nightmare. If you love unraveling, spine-tingling mysteries, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us for more stories that will keep you up at night. When I think back to my scouting days, the memories are often a mix of excitement, learning, and a hint of dread. Camping in rural Australia has always had its charm, with vast open skies, the scent of eucalyptus trees, and the quiet hum of nature. But there was one trip in particular that remains etched in my mind, not because of the camaraderie or the lessons learned, but because of the inexplicable fear it instilled in me. I was about 13 or 14 at the time, and the events of that night have stayed with me ever since. Our troop had set out to a familiar campsite, a place we visited often because it was only a short drive from the city. This site was usually bustling with scouts from all over the state during big events, but this time, it was just our small group of about a dozen people. We arrived in the early evening, and as usual, setting up camp took longer than expected. By the time our tents were pitched and everything was in order, the sun had dipped below the horizon and exhaustion had crept in. We barely had the energy to eat before crawling into our sleeping bags. The campsite was located in a secluded corner, bordered by a fence and a thick line of trees. If you ventured far enough, the trees gave way to a cliff overlooking a winding river. It was picturesque during the day, but took on a different character at night. The centerpiece of the campsite was a large toilet block surrounded by rocks. It was a bit of a walk from our tents, about 300 meters away, and separated into sections for adults and youth, males and females. Our tents were lined up in a neat row, spaced apart to allow for the guy ropes, as windy conditions were common in the area. On this particular night, though, the air was still. The first 2 nights passed without incident. We spent our days hiking, learning new skills, and sharing stories around the campfire. By the 3rd night, we were tired but content, looking forward to a good night's sleep before heading home the next day. My tent mates, Olivia and Jess, fell asleep quickly, but I've always struggled with sleep. I tossed and turned for a while before finally drifting off, only to wake up a short time later. At first, everything seemed normal. The campsite was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I closed my eyes, hoping to fall back asleep, but then I heard it. The distinct sound of footsteps on the grass. The ground was lush and slightly damp, making a soft crunching noise underfoot. My initial thought was that someone from our group had woken up to use the toilet block. But then I realized I hadn't heard the familiar zip of a tent opening. The footsteps grew louder, approaching our tent. I sat up slightly, straining to hear. They stopped just outside. My heart raced as I glanced over at Olivia and Jess, both sound asleep. The footsteps moved again, this time circling our tent. It wasn't unusual for someone to walk around at night, but this felt different. The movements were deliberate, almost calculated. I tried to convince myself it was just one of our leaders checking on us, but something about it felt off. The steps continued, looping around the entire row of tents before returning to ours. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they retreated toward the tree line. I lay there, frozen, unsure of what to do. After what felt like an eternity, I shook Olivia awake. She was groggy at first, but quickly understood the seriousness of the situation. Together, we listened in tense silence. For a while, there was nothing, and I started to think maybe it was over. But then the footsteps returned. They were slow at first, deliberate, almost taunting. They circled our tent again, but this time they grew faster, each step more frantic than the last, until it sounded like someone was running laps around us. Every so often, something brushed against the side of the tent. Olivia clung to me, her breathing shallow, and Jess, now awake, joined us in our terrified huddle. None of us dared to make a sound. The running continued for what felt like minutes, though it was likely much shorter. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I mustered every ounce of courage I had and decided to look outside. Gripping a tent peg as if it were some kind of weapon, I slowly unzipped the bottom of the tent. Lying flat on my stomach, I peered out into the darkness. The moon cast a faint glow over the campsite, but there was nothing to see. No shadows, no movement, nothing to explain the sounds. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. None of us slept. When morning came, we recounted our experience to the leaders. They dismissed it as animals, or perhaps one of us playing a prank, but I wasn't convinced. The footsteps had been too human, too deliberate. And how could anyone move that quickly around our tents without tripping over the ropes in the dark? As we packed up to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been watched. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see something or someone standing there. The leaders brushed off our concerns, but Olivia, Jess, and I knew what we had heard. The experience left me wary of camping for a long time. Even now, years later, the memory of that night sends a chill down my spine. In the years since, I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was an animal, though I've never heard of any local wildlife behaving like that. Some have suggested it could have been a prank by another camper, but our group was the only one there that night. Others point to the rich folklore of rural Australia, stories of spirits and beings tied to the land. I don't know what to believe, but I do know this. Something strange happened that night, something I can't explain. I've returned to that campsite a few times since then, each visit bringing a mix of nostalgia and unease. The place looks the same during the day, but at night, it feels different, as if the darkness holds secrets just waiting to be discovered. I've never experienced anything like that night again, but every time I lie awake in a tent, I can't help but listen for the sound of footsteps on the grass. It was my birthday not too long ago, and to celebrate, a friend of mine came into town. We decided to do something different and go camping for a night. We set out early, leaving at 4 in the morning, aiming to get to a secluded spot. The drive started off uneventful, but everything changed the moment we turned onto the dirt road that would take us to the campsite. The second we left the main highway, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. It wasn't constant. It came in waves, each one more intense than the last. I didn't say anything to my friend, but the air in the car felt heavy, like we were carrying something with us. About 20 minutes into the drive, he broke the silence, saying, "I felt something off for a while now." I just nodded, admitting I felt it too. There was no denying it. Something was wrong, though we couldn't pinpoint what. The unease grew as we drove deeper into the wilderness. The road stretched endlessly in front of us, winding through dense trees that seemed to close in on us the further we went. Every now and then, I caught a whiff of stale cigarettes, even though neither of us smoked. My friend stayed quiet after his initial comment, but I could see him gripping the wheel tightly. When we finally reached the turnoff for the campsite, we both instinctively agreed we couldn't stop. The idea of getting out of the car felt impossible, like we were breaking some unspoken rule just by being there. Instead, we kept driving until we reached a small town. We parked in a well-lit area and waited for the sun to rise. As soon as daylight broke, the oppressive feeling lifted, and we were able to breathe normally again. That's when my friend told me something that sent chills down my spine. He said he'd been seeing figures standing by the roadside during the drive. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching as we passed. I hadn't seen anything like that, but the stale cigarette smell made more sense in hindsight. The rest of the day went surprisingly well. We explored the area, cooked some food, and even laughed about how spooked we'd been earlier. It almost felt like the strange experience had been a bad dream. But as night fell, the unease started creeping back in. This time, it wasn't the waves of fear, but something more tangible. We settled into our tents, trying to brush it off, but the quiet was unsettling. Then came the voices. Faint at first, like a murmur carried on the wind. It sounded like people talking, though we couldn't make out the words. We stayed in our tents, frozen, trying to rationalize it as other campers nearby. But the voices didn't stop. Hours passed, and the murmuring grew louder. Then suddenly, there was a shriek, sharp and piercing, cutting through the night like a blade. It lasted only a moment, but left an eerie silence in its wake. That was the breaking point for us. We grabbed our things and moved to the truck, locking the doors and huddling inside. There, we finally managed to get some sleep, though it was fitful at best. The next morning, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. On the drive back, the sunlight made everything feel normal again, but the memory of that night lingered. Later, I did some research on the area and discovered it had a dark history. Around 200 years ago, there had been a massacre of native people on that land. Whether or not that had anything to do with what we experienced, I can't say. But it's hard to ignore the connection. Looking back, the trip feels like a blur, a series of moments stitched together by a thread of unease. The figures my friend saw, the smell of cigarettes, the voices in the night, it all adds up to something I can't explain. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but there's a part of me that wonders if we stumbled into something we weren't supposed to disturb. Whatever it was, it's left me with more questions than answers. Even now, when I think about that shriek in the night, my skin crawls. It's a reminder that there are places in this world where the past lingers, where the echoes of what once was refuse to fade away. Maybe some things are better left unexplored. Two weeks ago, I went on a camping trip with my family to a place in California called Ice House. It's one of those remote spots where you're supposed to disconnect from the world and soak in nature. No cell service, no distractions. Just the trees, the stars, and the sound of the wind. I'd always been more of a loner, and since my siblings and cousins were paired off with their partners, I got a tent all to myself. At first, it seemed perfect. Just me, solitude, and the wilderness. The first couple of nights were uneventful, the kind you expect on a trip like this. Days were spent hiking and fishing, and evenings were filled with laughter and the crackling of the campfire. By the third night, I was settling into the rhythm of camping life. That night, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence where you start noticing every little sound, the rustling of leaves, the faint chirp of crickets, even your own heartbeat. It was around 10 or 11 p.m., and everyone else had already retreated to their tents. I wasn't sleepy yet, so I stayed up scrolling through TikTok, trying to ignore the creeping unease that seemed to settle over the campsite. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. They crunched on the dry pine needles circling my tent. My first thought was that one of my cousins was trying to mess with me. Without looking up, I muttered, "Screw you." Just loud enough for whoever it was to hear. But the footsteps stopped. Not faded away, just stopped, as if whoever it was had frozen in place. Curiosity won over fear, so I unzipped the small window of my tent and peered out. The moonlight filtered through the tall pines, casting long, eerie shadows on the forest floor. But there was no one there. Not a single movement, not even a rustle. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, and went back to scrolling, though my heart was still racing. The next day passed without incident. Everyone was in high spirits, sharing jokes and telling stories by the fire as the sun set. I had almost forgotten about the strange footsteps from the night before. But as the night wore on, that uneasy feeling crept back in. At some point, I decided to head into the woods for a quick break. The firelight barely reached beyond the first few trees, so I used my phone flashlight to guide my way. The forest felt alive in the dark, every branch and shadow playing tricks on my eyes. That's when I noticed it. A figure standing about 10 feet away. It looked like a man, maybe a hiker. He was tall, with a large backpack slung over his shoulders. For a moment I thought he might need help, but something about him was off. He just stood there, motionless, watching me. The panic hit before I could fully process what I was seeing. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I bolted back to the campsite, nearly tripping over roots in my hurry. My chest heaved as I tried to explain to my dad what had just happened. Without hesitation, he grabbed his shotgun, and the rest of the group joined us with flashlights. We combed the area where I had seen the figure, calling out into the dark. But there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no movement, just the endless forest, silent and still. The next morning, we reported the encounter to a park ranger. He listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with every detail. When we were done, he simply said, We've had a lot of reports of paranormal activity in this area. He went on to explain that while there hadn't been any recent deaths reported nearby, Ice House had a long history of strange occurrences. People often claimed to see figures or hear voices in the woods, but there was never any evidence to support their stories. We decided not to take any chances and packed up that same morning. Instead of heading home, we relocated to a campsite closer to civilization. It wasn't as secluded, but the safety of being near other people felt worth the trade-off. Even now, I can't shake the memory of that figure in the woods. Was it just a lost hiker, or was it something else entirely? The image of his face keeps coming back to me, expressionless, unblinking, almost unreal. Since then, nights have been the hardest. Every creak of my house or shadow outside my window pulls me back to that moment. The rational part of me wants to dismiss it, to believe it was just a figment of my imagination or a trick of the light. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. The forest at Ice House holds its secrets tightly, and I've come to realize that some mysteries are better left unsolved.